Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Suresh Nanwani, Professor of Practice of Durham University, and I'm speaking now from Manila, Philippines. And I wish to welcome you all to the final session. And I wish to welcome you all to the final session of the 2020 CIBEL Young Scholar Workshop today. And I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past, present, and emerging. We have 3 speakers today and 2 commentators who I will introduce later. And what I like to do is, because we are in a time frame and to maximize the best of it, I would first like to give a brief overview of the issues to be discussed in this session. And this session is on Chinese international business and trade law. We start off with China's landmark Foreign Investment Law, FIL for short, and the fundamental principle of FIL, focusing on the leveling of the playing field, which is the principle. Second, we discuss China's response to market-oriented conditions in the proposal on the ongoing World Trade Organization, WTO reform, and its implications. Third and last, we shift from China and WTO to cover COVID-19, what we are all facing through right now, with reference to China-EU trade and investment relations. The focus will be on the challenges for these 2 dominant powers, China and EU. And we would be discussing the EU-China Strategic Outlook 2019 and mask diplomacy. I wish to be brief because I think we've got lots to cover and I'd like to actually encourage that. So without further ado, let me please introduce the first speaker, who is Associate Professor Huijin Jiang of Zhejiang Science Tech University. Huijin?
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chair, panel, and all the audience. It is my great pleasure here to share with you my recent research on China's foreign investment law. China's landmark foreign investment law was passed in 2019 and became effective on January the 1st, 2020. So this law is based on the fundamental principle of leveling the playing field for foreign investors. So this is what I'm going to focus on today. This principle makes evident that China will treat foreign and domestic investors equally. This position is an obvious sign of China's continuous liberalization of foreign investment regulation. In my opinion, this principle, if can be well implemented, will increase China's attractiveness to foreign investment in the context of trade and investment protectionism. So in the next 10 minutes, I will give an overview of the provisions in China's foreign investment law that manifest the principle, also what China has done so far to implement the principle and what future legislation should address. To begin with, China didn't bring up the principle until 2013, but the spirit of the principle was not new. As background information, in the initial stage of China's opening up policy, foreign invested entities and domestic entities followed different rules. This regulatory approach suggested that the playing field for them was not leveled. In later years, the playing field had become more leveled, especially China's accession to the WTO in 2001 significantly expanded its obligation to grant national treatment to foreign investors and their investments in pursuit of its WTO commitments. And by the end of 2010, China unified the taxation system regarding foreign invested entities and domestic entities, and this was another significant move. In 2013, China officially brought up the principle of leveling the playing field when it started to pilot the pre-entry national treatment and negative list regulatory approach in the Shanghai pilot free trade zones. So this means that inside the free trade zone, only for sectors on the negative list are government approval required, and for sectors not on the list, the playing field is leveled. So this regulatory approach was then applied nationwide in 2016. Ever since then, the principle has been frequently referred to in various official documents, and finally in 2019, China passed its foreign investment law, which is based on this fundamental principle of leveling the playing field. This foreign investment law lays great emphasis on equal treatment of foreign investment, putting foreign investors on a more level playground with domestic investors and giving them equal protections. These are very good news. This is very good news for foreign investors and their investment. However, the law declares only the framework of the principle. Details of its implementation are lacking. Given its lack of details, this law will be challenging for foreign investors and for the Chinese central and local government regulators. The law, the foreign investment law, manifests the principle from several aspects. So during the entry stage, it clarifies that equal treatment is given to foreign investment not included in the list. So in the negative list, so it continued the pre-established national treatment and negative list management system. And during the operation of foreign investments, it offers them equal treatment in the application of various supporting policies, in the participation in government procurement, and so on. During the exiting stage, the law does not specify the exiting of foreign investment literally, other than saying that foreign investors may freely remit out of China the income from liquidation according to relevant laws. But the reference to the company law and partnership enterprise law implies that the applicability of same rules as domestic investors. However, the rules above lacks the details needed in applying the principle. For instance, Article 9 of the law states that the state's various policies to support the development of entities shall equally apply to foreign invested entities. The text is very general to know how it will work in practice. It provides that supporting policies shall be applied equally, but it doesn't define what supporting policies are. Therefore, more details ought to be provided in a series of supporting documents. In fact, since the promulgation of the foreign investment law in 2019, China has taken effective steps to implement its avowed principle of leveling the playing field. These moves either provide more details on implementing the principle or abolish the rules that are no longer applicable under the new regime. To give a few examples, first, the State Council issued the regulation for implementing the foreign investment law in late 2019. The regulation makes clearer provisions on the implementation of the principle. For instance, it clarifies that those supporting policies include government funding arrangements, tax reductions, and so on. And as a vivid example of these supporting policies, China applies tax reductions due to the impact of the coronavirus pandemic, and these tax reductions apply also to foreign invested entities. Second, the State Council issued also the regulation on optimizing the business environment, and one essential content of the regulation is the equal protection of all market participants, which consist of foreign invested entities and domestic entities. Third, the latest negative list 2020 further reduced the number of restricted and prohibited items from 40 to 33. So in addition to the above supporting documents issued, China has abolished also many rules that were previously applied to foreign invested entities. In particular, the Ministry of Commerce has abolished 62 regulations which are inconsistent with the principle or inconsistent with the foreign investment law. So these are all evidence of China's implementation of the principle. In short, the insurance of new regulations and the cleaning up of inconsistent rules has made a very good start, but more work is yet to be done. On the one hand, the State Council and the Ministry of Commerce has done a great deal of work in screening their rules according to the spirit of the principle, while the other departments haven't done much yet. For instance, other central departments like NDRC and local authorities have also formulated numerous regulations on foreign investment administration in the past 40 years. Some of the rules are in conflict with the foreign investment law and the principle. Therefore, these departments or the State Council in their stead should conduct an orderly revision of their regulations and clarify whether these rules remain applicable. On the other hand, the State Council shall also take active moves to fill the gaps due to authorized legislation. For instance, the foreign investment law stipulates that existing foreign invested entities may retain for 5 years their original organizational structure before transiting into those like domestic investors. And the State Council is authorized to issue implementing measures for the transition. However, that measure is not issued yet. To conclude, the implementation of the principle requires an overhaul housekeeping of China's existing rules related to the foreign investment regulation. To date, China has made a good start, but more work is yet to be done, as just mentioned. So once these rules are clarified, they will become more transparent to potential foreign investors, and this would then improve further China's business environment and increase China's attractiveness to foreign investment. So thank you for your attention. That's all for my presentation, and the comments and questions are more than welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hui Chin. If there's one takeaway I got from you was some good work has been done, and it's been a good start, but more has yet to be done for transparency and improvement of China business environment. Thank you so much for that. I do apologize to you and to all that I had not introduced you earlier. So let me just quickly say that Dr. Jiang obtained a PhD degree in law from the University of New South Wales in 2017 with an Excellence Award. She's currently associate professor at the School of Law and Politics at Zhejiang Science Tech University that I mentioned. Prior to this position, she was postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Law, Singapore Management University. She has interest in foreign investment law, which is very obvious here as we can see, company law and comparative law, with a particular focus on China, Australia and Singapore. Her recent publications in English appear in a number of journals, example, Journal of World Trade Law, Asia Pacific Law Review, Civil Justice Quarterly, and Xinhua China Law Review. Thank you very much. And now we will go to the next speaker. And the next speaker that we have here, is Assistant Professor Lu Yao Che of China University of Political Science and Law. And let me first, before I pass the floor to her, give the abstract title, which is China's Response to the Market-Orientated Conditions. That's how I see it here. Proposal for the WTO reform and its implications in the era of post, in parenthesis, COVID-19. So on her bio, she's really got a great bio here. Let me just rattle it off. It's Lu Yao is an assistant professor and a supervisor for master students at the School of International Law, China University of Political Science and Law. She holds a master's in law degree from Renmin University of China and Doctor of Philosophy degree from the University of Nottingham. She was a visiting scholar at the University of Dundee in 2019. Her current research focus is the legal implications of contemporary state-directed economic institutions and their impacts on the development of the international economic order. Her recent research interests include the legal embodiment of the US-China trade frictions, the reform of the world trading system, and the prospect of the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. Regarding her teaching in CUPL, she is presently the convener of the Principles of International Economic Law module and the International Technology Transfer module for LLB students and co-convener of the International Trade Law. And I wish to pass over the floor to her. Lu Yao.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all the organizers. This was a wonderful event. This is my great honor to be here to present my work. As already introduced by Professor, by Chair, my title is actually about a proposal during the time of the WTO, World Trade Organization reform. This was proposed by a series of countries, but led by the US. And China indeed made some responses to it, but not so integral, but fragmented in a series of documents. That is why it is not attracting a lot of attention. And I would like to divide my whole presentation into 4 sections. One is some background, something about the proposal, and then some underlying concerns behind the proposal, and then China's response. And finally, I talk about whether this response has some implications in the specific time of great difficulty, the time of COVID-19 pandemics, right? So to understand what the proposal is about, we better track the history and explore how the proposal was ever formulated. The US, as I said, played a leading role, but it got together with the EU and Japan. They drafted some joint statement, actually seven statements. All of those statements include attitude that the WTO reform should deal with non-market oriented practices by some members. Of course, they target China, and recently in this year, 2020, the US submitted a separate WTO proposal regarding this. It is entitled The Importance of the Market-Oriented Conditions to the World Trading System. Well, the proposal actually includes 2 parts. One is about to set the market-oriented conditions as a principle, so some values that will guide the forthcoming WTO reform. And the second one is something quite specific compared to the first one. It is to establish the existence of some criteria. So there are 7 or 8 criteria to describe what a market-oriented economy or industry should be like. Well, for example, the price cost inputs of the enterprises or the industry should not be under the command or order of a state, but by the market. So all the enterprises will observe the changes in the prices of the market and then make something that correspondently. Okay, so from this proposal, we can see that, well, there are some underlying concerns. So basically it's like this. There are 3 concerns. One is about some instrumental things. Here I mean instrumental because the US just treated China as something that is unfair to the existing multilateral trading system. Well, the state is empowered with some particular capacity to regulate the state or the market, or sometimes it will just injected some kind of motivations directly to the market and to influence the allocation of resources and products. If under these circumstances, that will be a phenomenon which is the most innovative enterprises will not be selected, will not survive, but instead those who make it aligned with the state will ever survive, right? The US just treated a WTO as a branch of rules that will allow other countries to deal with, to respond to those kind of state-led practices. But now it was disappointed. The US find, well, I try to label all Chinese state-owned enterprises as public bodies and try to anti-subsidy, like something countervailing measures, but I failed because the WTO system said I will act inconsistently with the subsidy rules and the WTO system. So the US, on the instrumental level, argues that the WTO system lacked of a series of rules to deal with the non-market-oriented practices. That is the first level. And the second level is about institutional background. The US and some other countries just believed that, well, such a system, such a non-market-oriented system will enable some unfair advantages. So such a system will not be tolerated by the WTO. That is institutional. It does not only concern, well, some specific practices, but the system itself. And finally, something about ideology, so value orientation. Well, we do not always pursue market power as something that is the most important thing, but sometimes we will value it as the core principles of the WTO. That is the mandate of the WTO to someone's point. And that is what the US would like to argue. So the US said the WTO should not be so inclusive so as to tolerate those kind of non-market-oriented conditions. Okay, so I just mentioned three levels: instrumental and institutional, and finally ideological, as I just make them into, sorry, I just put them in the chat bar, and I just paid a photo. I once made a PowerPoint slides, but actually that is a conclusion pages. You may refer to that. Okay, so after analyzing the concerns behind the proposal, we will find actually China has responded those kind of issues at the three different levels. So once we observe those different three levels, we will find China made, yes, sorry, did I miss something? Okay, sorry for the interruption. I will continue. Yes. So at each levels, there are three types of issues. One is about substantive issues. So China tried to join a boundary between the power of the state and the market. And the second issue is what the role of the WTO should play. So what the WTO should do. And the third one, what a particular member of the WTO is supposed to do. Those three kind of issues are included at each level of the proposal. So I will address each issue specifically in my paper, but so because of the limitation of time, I will only do this briefly here at the level of specific instruments. And concerning the substantive issues, China proposed the revival of non-actionable subsidies. So according to some scholars' view, it is something to counter the US and EU's proposal because they proposed to expand the red light categories of subsidies, but China refused to do so. But actually, China's response is larger, it's more than a bargaining strategy, because it strives to know their, well, the state should have the power to inject motivations to the market to expand the green light categories of subsidies. And then it's about what the role of the WTO should play. China is suggesting the WTO to maintain a universal and unconditional treatment of non-discrimination. So market orientation conditions may not be set to be a preconditions for a country to acquire a non-discriminatory treatment. Yes, so there's not a two-folded membership that could be found in the WTO system. Well, although we are in different types of systems, but not preconditional to some satisfaction of market economy as a precondition for me to enjoy the non-discrimination treatment. That is China's response to the role of the WTO at the level of instrumental things. Okay, so third issue is about how a member should play under this level of instruments. Okay, so China warns there if given a single member too much discretion, then they will abuse such capacity. So here shows some ambiguity of the wording of one criterion regarding private law. Well, the EU once said, well, if the law of an economy is not equally applied to each market actors, so I will say, though, that is not a market economy. But this wording is evoluted because now the US said the law should not only be equally applied, but it also should be market-oriented. So I use the word market-oriented to explain market orientation. Yes. So that will constitute ambiguity and will augment the discretion for some members to abuse their capacity in dealing with market-oriented or non-market-oriented conditions. Okay, the second level is institutional, which means, well, China tried to distinguish market-oriented and market enabling, those two words. As for China, the presence of the government itself will not itself invalidate the market. So we will now say because the state is so powerful, so the market power will not exist. Okay. And finally, on the ideological level, China suggests that the reliance to the market does not negate the fact that is a market power. So an economy like China could rely on public ownership system, but it is also a market economy. So there's different dimensions, and the role of the WTO system is actually to be a mediator, to be an interface to different institutions. Okay, so here comes my final conclusion. Well, in the area of COVID-19, China's response may be implicated because it tried to discuss in depth the substantive boundaries and also the specific roles of the WTO system instead of using a discourse of market economy to negate everything. So just trying to make this things more open and maybe more public discussion is quite welcomed, should be welcomed in the furthering ongoing discussions about the WTO reform. Okay, thank you very much. And that's all. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lu Yao. Thank you. Again, I see we have a speaker who again ends with this note of transparency. So that was what was reiterated by the previous speaker, and that's good. I quite like the three levels of concern. I'm just trying to refresh myself: the institutional, the instrument, and the ideological, and the responses that you gave based on the roles China could play. And I quite like the framework you gave. I know you had a time limitation, but we all go through that. So thank you very much. And now onward to the third speaker. Our speaker now is Mr. Salvatore F.P. Barilla of University of Edinburgh. His abstract title is EU-China Trade and Investment Relations and COVID-19. So we've got actually COVID-19 right in the abstract itself, and it's on old struggles and new challenges. On his biography, Salvatore is a PhD student at the School of Social and Political Science of the University of Edinburgh. He obtained a combined bachelor and master's degree in law at LUISS Louis University, Rome, and a double master's degree in European Studies at Louis University and in International Relations at China Foreign Affairs University, Beijing. He worked as a legal intern in multiple law firms in different countries and as an intern at the commercial office of the Italian Embassy in Belgium. His current research investigates EU-China trade disputes in the WTO, and he's interested in the international political economy, international trade and investment law, and in EU-China studies. So without further ado, Salvatore.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you all for having me here. And good afternoon and good morning from Italy. So today, yes, I will talk about EU-China trade and investment relations, and I would like to try to assess whether COVID-19 changed these institutional relations between the two actors. As we know, the past few months have been characterized by the outbreak of COVID-19, and although we are far from being out of the woods, it seems important to do a little bit of an investigation on the consequences of the pandemic. So first of all, I would like to give a few figures about the relations with China and the EU. So according to the EU Commission in 2019, China was the EU's second largest partner when it comes to trade, and the EU was China's biggest partner. So trading goods was worth over 1.5 billion a day in the past year, and the total value of export from the EU to China was almost 200 billion, while the import was over 300 billion. In 2018, services export from the EU to China was worth 46 billion, and China exported 30 billion to the EU. So these are enormous amounts of money when it comes to bilateral relations between two main actors. And in this sense, it seems necessary to trace back the institutional relations between these two actors to see how and if they changed and how they implemented. So the key steps for these relations are traced back to 1975. So EU-China relations have always been focused and driven by economic interests. Other elements of cooperation like security and defense have been added throughout the years. So the diplomatic relations started in 1975, but only 10 years later, in 1985, we have the EU-China Agreement on Trade and Economic Cooperation, which hasn't been updated yet, actually. Nonetheless, the first institutional forum of cooperation was the EU-China Summit. The first EU-China Summit was in 1998, and the EU-China sat together in London. And the main points of discussion were focused around the fostering of cooperation and integration of China in the European market. So once again, the main driver of cooperation between the two actors was economy and trade. But a major step towards a more integrated partnership was certainly represented by the EU-China 2020 Strategic Agenda for Cooperation of 2013. This strategic agenda was a document issued by the EU Commission to foster cooperation and integration between the two actors. It's an important document because it is based and drafted, taking into account the Chinese 12th five-year plan. As we know, the five-year plan is a document that gives the political agenda of the Chinese government for 5 years. and it's interesting because it's one of the few examples of the EU documents that are drafted among other countries, third countries, governmental documents. So this strategic agenda was centered on three main areas, which is peace and cooperation, prosperity, sustainable development. This strategic agenda was a sort of roadmap for the relations of the two actors until 2019. So it is clear that the EU was trying to set up an effective strategy for cooperation between with China, and evidences are other documents like the 2016 joint communication on elements for a new EU strategy on China, the 2018 European Parliament resolution on the state of EU-China relations. And the main focus of all of these documents was the economic relations between the two actors. And it's really interesting because since the very first documents, official documents of the relations, there is an intensive use of terms in the documents like reciprocity and level playing field, and there are indicators of positive and confident attitude towards the cooperation and the relations among the two actors. But a main turning point of the EU-China relations is given by last year's joint statement of the European Union, which is the EU-China Strategic Outlook. So this document represents a turning point because the rhetoric right now is different. The situation seems to have changed. Indeed, China is more interested in European countries with the progression of the Belt and Road initiatives, looking out single member states of the European Union, and with the increase in tensions on trade with the United States, China for the European Union has become a systemic rival and a strategic competitor. And this is the first time that in a European document we see such a recognition of China as an equal partner, and China is no more a developing country, is a strategic competitor and a systemic rival. So it's more of an equal, and Europe is asking for a more balanced and reciprocal economic relations. So these documents, though, still keeps asking for closer cooperation that might be achieved by common engagement of Europe and China in the reform of the multilateral system. And as my fellow speaker presented previously, an example of this was the shared view of the reformed international community with the proposal of the reform of the World Trade Organization. But other examples are the shared proposal of the UN system. However, we know that the past few months have characterized by the outbreak of COVID-19, and trade and investment relations between China and the EU was certainly been affected. According to the European Council on Foreign Relations dataset, Chinese medical donations to Europe accounted for 148 units of donation. However, we see a sort of difference in attitude between China and the EU. Chinese attitude towards medical donation was a sort of more was less subtle than the European donations to China. Indeed, we see the so-called mask diplomacy of China towards the European Union. Nonetheless, this health crisis did not stop the institutional relations and the institutional dialogue between the two actors. Indeed, despite the difficulties and the postponement of some meetings, the EU and China managed to virtually meet at the 22nd EU-China summit. And during the summit, the Chinese and European delegations dealt with different issues. Of course, COVID-19 was one of the main topics of discussion, but of course there were economic and trade issues at stake. In particular, the dialogue focused on fostering negotiations of the Comprehensive Investment Agreement. The Comprehensive Investment Agreement is a sort of update of the 1985 agreement. But what can be affirmed by COVID-19 and the 22nd EU-China summit is that COVID-19 pandemic did not seem to significantly alter institutional relations between China and the EU, because after the summit, the EU-China relations fact sheet was issued by the European External Action Service, and the rhetoric seemed to be in line with the strategic outlook that was issued last year. So yes, to conclude, we can say the COVID-19 pandemic, at least until now, did not seem to alter the relations between China and the EU, but the limitations are clear because time factor is a constraint. Only a few months have passed since the outbreak of COVID-19, so it's too soon probably to say to state that COVID-19 didn't have an effect on EU-China institutional relations. But what can we say is that dialogue between EU and China is extremely important, especially now with the pandemic, and West versus East does not need to be and to represent an oxymoron. And in a post-COVID world, EU-China relations are more than necessary, and cooperation is long welcome. So thank you for listening to me, and of course, questions are more than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salvatore. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed it, and the articulation. You came through a long way from starting off with China being EU's second largest partner, and you walked through 1975 to 1998 EU-China summit, and with the current state of affairs, COVID-19. Again, what I kind of liked was you mentioned level playing field. So I like to draw these teams because I can see them emerging, coming up, yeah, and that's good. So again, included in that, what I assume would be transparency as well. And your closing point was dialogue is more important now than ever between EU and China. Thank you very much for that. I would like now to move on to the commentators, and we have two, as I mentioned earlier on. So the first commentator we have is Dr. Wei-Huan Zhao. He's member of UNSW Law's Herbert Smith Freehills CIBEL Center. And let me just give you a brief, probably he doesn't need to be introduced, but I will still say it because it's important that everyone knows who he is. Wei-Huan's research focuses on the laws of WTO, customs law, especially trade remedies, free trade agreements, Chinese commercial law, China's regulations of international trade and investment, China's integration into the international and regional economic order. Prior to joining UNSW Law in 2015, he was a trade and commercial lawyer at a top-tier Australian law firm in Sydney. I let him now give the floor now to Wei-Huan to comment. Wei-Huan?
Thanks, Chair, for the introduction, and also thanks for all the speakers for the very good talk and very concise one, given the time limits we have here. So what we will do here, since we're doing a Young Scholar workshop, so instead of asking many questions, I may just kind of integrate my questions into my comments, and basically from the perspective of helping you to continue your research in the directions that you have already been doing. So I will just go one by one in order, and then maybe if in the Q&A section, maybe you can provide some comments on my comments. So Hui-Chun, now again, this is a very timely topic, and I think we all appreciate that the Chinese new foreign investment law has provided a new development that tries to provide the leveling playing field for foreign investors. But I think, as we all know, the Chinese law is always drafted in a very abstract manner and sometimes non-transparent. And sometimes despite the implementation regulation, that we always have issues with implementation at the central and domestic levels. So my issue is really about dig into the implementation of this particular new development and really seeing through how this new law has been implemented at the central and also domestic levels. Now, I think this goes into very practical considerations, because we need to really think about what kind of non-discrimination standards or philosophy has been established, but in the meantime has been undermined, at least to some extent, at the implementation level. So I just give some examples. Maybe you can dig into and as a case study of issues. The first one is really about the entry level, the pre-establishment national treatment. And obviously, it's not really a pure or absolute national treatment given the negative list. So the question is, to what extent that foreign investors are still treated differently than domestic ones, apart from what is on the negative lists, like, for example, the equity limitations or those kind of stuff. But in other fields that hasn't actually been said very clearly in the law or regulation itself, whether this has been discriminatory treatment in practice. Now, I may just draw your attention to some of the new developments or some of the most gray areas in the legislation. The one thing I can think about is the national security assessment in China. And we don't really know. There has been no guidance about how national security test will be conducted and how that will be applied to foreign investors, or whether it will be applied equally to foreign investors and domestic investors in sensitive sectors. Another area you would look at is once you have entered the country, whether there is any actual different treatment between foreign invested companies and domestic companies in terms of, for example, merger and acquisition, especially the acquisition involves a state-owned enterprise or a sensitive industry, so or sensitive assets, right? So I know the law says, you know, pre-establishment and post-establishment national treatment, but these are very gray areas that, you know, you can always apply national security concerns into it. So just a couple of examples. And finally, as you know, I'm concerned because we did a paper together on technology transfer. And we all know that the law tried to deal with the concerns from the US about technology transfer by basically saying that no technology transfer should occur in the course of foreign investment. But how that has been implemented at the in practice, right? So that, I think, relates to the question about the pre-establishment national treatment, because if approval, or at least de facto approval, is required, then there's always going to be a chance for the authorities to encourage technology transfer. So I'm just putting some of the questions there, and as you can see, the overall question is really about implementation and transparency. It's not really about the law, what the law says, but what is actually happening in practice. So that's just my few comments to you, Hui-Chin. Lu Yao, again, very timely topic. And you know, I'm very interested in this topic as well. I appreciate that you have actually divided the concerns or the analysis into different kind of factors. I find it's a useful way to kind of make suggestions and also run your analysis. But I think the kind of very overarching problem I had with all of these arguments is really about, it's not your arguments I have a problem with, but the arguments from the others on China's non-market economy and also the establishment of the market economy conditions, is the fact that most of the problems are not China specific, right? So you talked about subsidies, you talked about sufficiency of rules, you talked about non-actionable subsidies, you talk about the criteria for market economy or non-market economy. None of them are really China specific. If anything, there has been a lot of China specific rules that really limits China's policy space in these areas. So for example, you talked about public body. The question really is whether the law is sufficient to deal with public bodies in China. And I guess the really distinction, the really dividing opinion between the US and China or others is really about whether all state-owned enterprises should be treated as a public body. So everything that state-owned enterprises provided should be treated as subsidies, right? So that's an extreme of the views. But I think the law has developed in a very balanced approach. Basically says that we need evidence to show that a particular entity is exercising function of the government, right? So the question here is that whether it will be reasonably balanced approach in terms of evidence gathering and also burden of proof to prove that an entity is actually exercising government function. So I always find it hard to accept an allegation that the WTO rules are themselves not sufficient without really looking into what the law actually says, right? Or without looking into what the law is actually applied throughout the years, and to really come up with the final conclusion and the informed and reasoned conclusion about whether the laws are adequate. Now, I also said that I don't think this is a China-specific issue. I think if you imagine that we are actually now back to the negotiating table, we talk about subsidies, non-actionable subsidies. I don't think this is actually China's specific claims. Most of the developing countries would like non-actionable subsidies and green lights. And the background of the whole subsidy negotiations is that the US wanted harder rules on subsidies and also softer rules on countervailing duties, right? And the other countries, including the EU and Japan, are actually against it. So I guess the final compromise is really about what we now have in the subsidy agreement. If we come back to the negotiating table to negotiate again, you're going to have the same problems, and you're going to have the same kind of two camps that will actually negotiate against each other. It's not really a China-specific problem. So I think when we consider this kind of debate about what will be whether market economy conditions needs to be kind of formulated in the WTO, what the conditions should be, we need to kind of have an overall picture about some of the issues are not China-specific. And finally, the criteria itself is very problematic. They are just what the domestic laws said and applied in the US and the EU for many, many years, right? They don't really have to push that through into the WTO if their concern is really just about China, because we know the China Accession Protocol, Section 15 already had this kind of things, flexibilities for them to do so, and they can continue to do so for many years since the China dropped its complaints against the EU last year about the non-market economy case. So this is just my brief comments for you to think about. Now, finally, Last speaker, I think you have provided a very, very good overview for all of us. It's very informative about the development or recent development of the China-EU relationship, economic relationship particularly. And I think your topic actually can be easily related to the first and the first two topics. So, for example, you talked about the EU-China bilateral investment negotiation that can easily fit into the new development in China about the new foreign investment law, and how that would actually going to impact on the bilateral foreign investment treaty negotiation, because many of the concerns that the two parties or the EU would have had before may have already been addressed by the new law. So the only thing I would think of is might be just more market access into some of the prohibited sectors, right? So it's kind of a relaxation of the negative list. So I think you may want to look into these things and to say, what would be the objective from the EU perspective, and whether these actually have been already addressed by the new law. And you also mentioned about the EU's concerns about the market economy, non-market economy of China. I mean, it's a concern for many people. But the question I want to come back to say is to say that you said the EU has increasingly treated China as a strategic partner, even though that they are actually competitors in the meantime. But on the other hand, the EU is joining the US and Japan, issuing a series of joint statements about subsidies and those kind of stuff. So my question is how EU should position itself in the two kind of camps, right? So in collaboration with China to deal with some of the issues, or in collaboration with the US and Japan to push China to make changes. So I'm not quite sure how you would actually address these issues. I'm actually asking you a question about these things, because I want to know more about how the EU position itself in these issues. Now, final thing I want to say is also related to the previous presentation about subsidies. It's becoming a growing issue from the EU perspective, and the EU published a white paper very recently about what they call the transnational subsidies. So it's about that relates to China's subsidies provided to foreign companies, foreign governments, and that involves the Belt and Roads as well. So the question is, how would EU join China or cooperate with China to address the subsidy issues? Now, before I conclude, I would just want to say that we should not forget that since the creation of the WTO, or since the creation of the GATT, or World Trading System, the largest and the most complicated subsidy case is between the EU and US, subsidizing their aviation national champion. It's not China. So if they want to discipline subsidies, they need to think about how they discipline their own subsidies as well. Now, this refers to my comments to Lu Yao as well. It's not really about China-specific problem. If we're going to come back to look at industry policies and subsidies, it's gonna involve everybody, because it's in the interest of everybody. And especially considering COVID, and because you guys mentioned COVID in your presentation, so I think I should conclude with COVID, even though we don't like it. I think the COVID created a scenario that everybody is increasingly using subsidies, and everybody is increasingly thinking that subsidies is a legitimate instrument to use. So everybody ignored what is in the rules and the potential implications or impacts on the multilateral trading system. So what will happen is that they will continue to do so after COVID, and everybody will be hit by the others' subsidies. And everybody will creating a more favorable playing field for their own companies at the cost of foreign companies, right? So how would they sort this out at the end? Should it be tit for tat, or should we all come back to the negotiating table for collective action? I conclude with that question. All right, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Wei Huan. Thank you. I really liked the fact that you gave your time to all three speakers, because that gives them food to digest and to think about, and also to consider. And of course, they can respond either through the Q&A you mentioned or in other modes as well. Thank you very much for that. I think if there's one thing I got from you was the way you interweaved, and I like that, because I had brought out issues like transparency, level playing field, and again, we see that coming out here again. The fact, like, the importance and the transparency being really important, for example, in the first speakers in Hui Jin's paper, and the papers being timely, and COVID, at the end of the day, what we come forward is now, and now is COVID as of now. And that brings us to the front, and how the dynamics can change, in the sense that what were issues before and how it takes a different paradigm now. So thank you very much for that. And we now move on to the second commentator. And the second commentator, again, needs no introduction, but I will read his bio. The second commentator is Professor Heng Weng, co-director of UNSW Law, Herbert Smith Freehills CIBEL Center, and he is the co-director there, as I mentioned, and as well, he researches into the Belt and Road Initiative, and in other topics as well, which include China and economic deglobalization. When I say D, I mean the D in parentheses, and central bank digital currency, CBDC for short. He was, or is, so he has had a string and is having a string of appointments, executive council member of One Global, 2 Asian, and all 3 Chinese societies of international economic law. He spoke at the WTO headquarters and leading institutions including Harvard University, Oxford University, New York University, and the LSE. He taught in Australia. I think he's still teaching there. And he's also in Canada, China, Japan, Singapore, and the US as visiting professor. And he has been frequently interviewed by the media. So without further ado, Heng, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suresh, for your kind introduction. And also, I would like to congratulate all the 3 speakers for the great presentation. I benefit a lot from that. And what I would like to say is about some comments, but also the question of you. I will have some general context in my mind and some general question for all 3 of you. And then I have some specific question about 2 for each of you. But you don't need to answer all of that. Only given a short time, only ones you feel that's comfortable to talk about. So basically, I like the idea that you have talked about. I think that's, we probably have to start, if we look at China international economic law, what is the context? I think before the COVID-19, and we already see the rise of China. So I think that's Salvatore also mentioned about Belt and Road Initiative, where we see that China has taken a much stronger position in the global governance. And also what I call is what I use the term is a selective reshaping. So China is arguably selectively reshape institutions, for example, AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and also for rules. If you look at some soft law, China is trying to reshaping, for example, regarding central bank digital currency at international standard setting bodies. And second context I would see before COVID-19 is technology. So here we see that technology complicates international economic law. Data flow is one issue, right? We see that data flow, China has a lot of restrictions in that, while US push a different direction in the CPTPP to no data localization, and EU largely follow the same one. Of course, EU-China relation, you have the issue about privacy protection. EU push for very high standards, and that's being a quite potential issue, I think, in the future. And also we see that central bank digital currency. China has been piloting central bank digital currency in in Xiong'an and also in Suzhou and so on and so forth. While US is also considering, given the Libra in the context, they are thinking of how to potentially have the digital dollar. These are also factors which affect trade, affect investment of our economy, because you can hardly live without currency. And the third context we have is obviously COVID. So COVID-19 bring a lot of new dynamics, trade restrictions, investment restrictions, but also stronger role by government. Government had to salvage the economic slowdown, which means more subsidies. So that reminds me of the issue. For example, Lu Yao mentioned that whether they have more incentive for different governments to provide subsidies, and whether they affect the future rulemaking in subsidy areas. So that's a general context. But what we see that there looks like to be more solid issues and more new challenges, and also old challenges. I'll give one example. I think I can summarize from all three view relationship between government and market. You see that government's role is think about Trump using a lot of the unilateral measures, and also you see the COVID-19 response. Definitely, government play a stronger role than before, and the markets in that vis-a-vis markets, government is a stronger role. And also many issues you raised, it's very difficult. Hui-Qin mentioned about foreign investment. Those regulation, a lot of administrative agency issues. It's not as easy as cut tariffs in the WTO. It's much more difficult about how to treat the individual investors. We can also mention those implementation issue. I find that's absolutely crucial. So you go to those difficult, long, difficult and systematic issue, subsidies, domestic regulation, social issues, or sustainable development mentioned by Salvatore. And another side, you see much fewer solutions. If you look at US and China, when US and China at the very beginning, I think it's been after double taxation of China, they will see US-China as an unprecedented engagement. But now if you see what happened nowadays, is what I have another paper, which I use the term of this engagement. US and China has much narrower engagement. They are no longer engaged in many areas like technology. If you look at phase one agreement between US and China, it's not really a lot about goods trade that involves the value chain. It's more about simple sale and purchase, agricultural products, for instance. So you see that we have a huge challenges, old and new one, and very problematic scenario, including WTO in the crisis. So we see that the government, the core, I think, one of the core issue, what's the relationship between the government and the markets. I think that applies to all three of you. For one, do we enter a new era after COVID-19? If you look at foreign investment regulation in China, as Hui-Qin mentioned, or this, the struggle for rules at all for the subsidy issues, it looks like that it's more difficult than before, because if the economic slow down, governments may have more incentive to provide subsidies, and that makes more perplex. And also for EU-China relationship, if you combine also with Brexit, and the COVID-19 has made also a lot of problems in terms of the bilateral relations, including those new and old trade issues. And for example, we probably rely more on e-commerce and data flow. Central bank digital currency also involve data flow. And so these are whether we enter a new era after COVID-19 in the area you talk about. Second, what are the influencing factors? To answer those questions, to analyze whether it's been new era, what are the influencing factors? As a purely legal issue, we should look at beyond that? You mentioned about the foreign investment, right? We rely on foreign investment law or whether they need more than domestic, regional, or international one, looking at geopolitical dynamics, value chain decoupling, moving out of the traditional multilateralism stage. We see a lot of deglobalization, Trump, and whether it be whether it should be Joe Biden. So those are the broader issues that may be relevant for your discussion about the second issue. What's the influencing factor? The third general question I'm thinking of: how do we solve the new issues? For example, what are the venues we should look at? I mentioned earlier for investments regulation in China, whether foreign investment law is enough, or if you look at subsidies, whether WTO is being ideal place to do so, because you think about WTO as over 160 members. I was kidding that it's hard to find favorites breakfast among 160 of you. I mean, I like the Chongqing Ludo. You may like the continental breakfast or whatever one you have. So that's been a kind of issue where you should think of, and also how about EU-China relation, the same issues, right? You really have EU-China investment treaty negotiation. People say that it's talk and talk, and where's the ahead of us? And so the specific question, quickly to Huiqing, that is what are the COVID-19's impact on foreign investment in China? Because that's also been a broader context, for China, because you see that already has been a pressure on diversify value chain, and whether that will affect foreign investment law enforcement or the China's approach to the foreign investment in China. And also, I'm quite between US and do you think that will affect foreign investment law of China or the China's regulation for investment in the long term? Because that's one of the key issue between US and China, and that's the most recent, binding agreements China signed. And third one, do we have sufficient? How do we address the potential issues raised by foreign investors? Whether foreign investment law itself suffice, or you may say, okay, we can look at foreign investment treaties, but not everyone has those kind of investment treaty with China. If you look at EU, for example, US, none of them has, least of them have any foreign investment treaty with China. So, that's I'll be interested in your thoughts on that. And then let's look at Lu Yao. One issue that again I mentioned earlier, I don't think US China has any common language about subsidies. So question is that where's the venue? Should they find venue, in the WTO or at the same time at bilateral or regional level? Because US push for CPTPP and China different free trade agreements. So I'm curious about your view about the venue for that. And also, secondly, how to bridge the. I think it's basically if you don't really have any common language, it's very hard to negotiate. I mean, it could be a very challenging one. So I'm interested in how do we avoid a situation where each one repeats their points, which doesn't make much sense. And finally, to Salvatore, I think one question that you mentioned about dialogue, I like it. Yeah, I think it's very important, but also we also see that dialogue also face a lot of challenges because they're slow, they don't really bring binding commitments. So I just wonder whether you think is how to address potential downsides of dialogue, or how to increase the efficiency of the dialogue. Whether there's any other ways in international relation can deal with the issue, because we really see those kind of issues. And also, secondly, I'm quite interested to see you mentioned about social issues, sustainable development. I think it's quite an important issue. EU, for example, highlights those social issues, labor, environment, and so on and so forth. China has may not have the same position. So I'm curious that if we look at social issues as one example, how do you see the future relation between EU and China in the post-COVID-19 era? Because they have different views, and also that both of them are affected by global dynamics, including those in the US. Again, I would like to thank all of you for the excellent talk, and also don't feel obliged to answer all of the questions. And I will finish here, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Heng Wing. Thank you so much. I appreciate the two commentators, their views, and I think it's great that the speakers were given opportunities to have their thoughts, their points being noted by the commentators with ideas, suggestions. You don't have to answer to all of them. You know, they're really food for thought, but of course you can engage more offline and all that. I actually checked. We don't seem to have many comments on the Q&A, but if they do come in, of course, they'll trickle in and I'll get it from Jane or from Fionn. So in the meantime, what I like to do is, you know, you've got a lot on your plate. So in the interest of time, and I can add that I love chunking noodles. I love continental breakfast. I love almost everything else. So the floor is yours, Hui Chin. Each speaker will have 3 minutes. I know it's short, but just 3 minutes. Pick out what you want to really focus on to reply, and it could be to either Wei Huan or to Heng, or to both. Or your own thoughts, additional thoughts. But with reference to those two would be better, because I think this will be viewed later on and really be good for that. So just share those thoughts that you have, please. Hui Chin.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Wei Huan and Heng, for the comments and questions raised regarding my research. I would like to kind of combine your questions and comments together and give my initial thinkings on your questions and comments. So definitely, due to the impact of the COVID-19, the foreign investment in China has been reduced due to the impact. So yes, it has a very the pandemic has hit the domestic and the global economies hard, and also it is the same situation in China, but it also provided kind of an opportunity to show that China is trying to, and China is implementing the foreign investment law to the extent that it is possible. So for instance, as I mentioned during my presentation, the foreign investment law states that tax reductions and ambitions will be applied equally to both domestic investors and foreign invested entities. And due to the impact of the COVID-19, China started to apply tax reductions for domestic investors and also equally apply to foreign invested entities. So I think that is a very vivid picture suggesting that China is implementing the leveling playing field in a very serious way. And also the MOFCOM, the Ministry of Commerce, has also implemented the negative list in a very serious way, in that like for sectors not on the list, approval is not required anymore. So regarding like Wei Huan mentioned that the law on paper and the law in action. So I think this is a common issue that is faced by regulators both in China and in other countries. So at this initial stage, China is trying to make its regulations, the law on paper, transparent to foreign investors, but it is also trying to make sure the law in action is suiting the spirit of the foreign investment law. So I think the law will be implemented according to the principle of the foreign investment law, and the foreign investment law is not enough for regulating foreign investment, that is for sure. For instance, the National Security Review may need further administration rules to regulate it, and for whether they are litigible after if there is a dispute between foreign investors and the Chinese government. Yeah, that's my initial response to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Hui Chin. Thank you very much. And now we'll move to the second speaker, and of course it's Lu Yao. So 3 minutes. I saw you taking notes and you were smiling as well. So good. You've obviously thought about it. Just capture what you want to say in 3 minutes, and you could have more, but it could be offline, but just 3 minutes to share us your valuable thoughts. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. Well, thank you, Professor Zhou and Professor Wang. Your comments are really very inspiring, so I just pick up some of my personal views and well reflected in my field further research. First, I would like to say, yes, there's a gap between the US and China, but the gaps are conflated together. One is about institutional setting. So does the US really attack on the state-owned enterprises per se, or just some effects resulted from some activities by the state-owned enterprises? Is that? So maybe we could conclude some rules that our rules are finally to be purposes driven or effect oriented, or just we want to reduce the existence of Chinese state-owned enterprises. So if you say, yes, China's state-owned enterprises harmed us, so just disappear, that is one kind of rules. And the second rules is that if the Chinese state-owned enterprises attacked as some kind of industries with some specific purposes, then we would like to allow those kind of activities. That is the second approach. And the third one is, because those kind of effects resulted from the activity, so we would like to have some criteria to assess those kind of effects, and then to allow some like unilateral or just the multilateral approaches to deal with those detrimental effects. That the third approaches. So we might put all of those topics together and try to be analytical, try to find more concentrated way to deal with them. And my second point is about, well, how to find a more appropriate venue to deal with those problems. First, actually, the U.S. does not really wish China to privatize all state-owned enterprises, as it said, because it influenced it because it just emphasized in some statements and documents that because of China's market conditions are not so appropriate, and because there's not because it's market disruptive, so we would like to make those effects disappear. Then we could make this problem more multilateral. It could not be dealt just on a bilateral scale, because bilateral dialogues is not sufficiently enough for different countries to put their concerns together to bring out an appropriate way to say what should be the boundary between appropriate effects, which is resulted from the traditional theory of comparative advantages, and some unfair advantages that is resulted from some state-led institutions. Yes, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lu Yao. Now we have the third speaker, and this is Salvatore. And again, I want to thank all the three speakers in advance for Salvatore as well here. The added benefit, because you're having a second bite at the cake now. It's good, and it's good because you're sharing your thoughts now with us, with those listening in, and in the forthcoming video link as well. So this is really good, and you can just keep to the main points you want to answer to two commentators. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Salvatore.
Thank you. Thank you, both professors, for the interesting comments and suggestions for my research. Well, I have to briefly answer both of your questions. I truly believe that there are at least two main problems in the EU-China relations. First of all is the different institutional structure. As we know, China is has one central government, while the European Union has to deal with the governments of the member states, especially when it comes to foreign policy. As we know, some of the European Union member states joined the Belt and Road Initiative, while others don't and are more reluctant in this attitude of the other member states. So this is one problem for sure. And another one is the as Professor Wang suggested, the different views on sustainable development between China and the EU. This is an extremely important question and problem that needs to be solved with the conclusion and the signature of the comprehensive agreement, the comprehensive investment agreement. So yeah, I believe that the solution after, of course, the dialogue between the European Union and China is the necessary conclusion of the agreement, because it needs to give more certainty for investors and reciprocal equal treatment of firms between China and the EU, and more market access for European firms in China and Chinese firms in Europe. So yes, there are many things to say, but I guess time's up. So thank you very much for this opportunity and for all your questions and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salvatore. In times like these, we are all under pressure, as you can see, but that's good. If there's anything, I like to highlight the 3 Ds here. You know, the 3 Ds of the debate, the discussion, and the dynamism of issues. That was what I really saw here, and it was really good. So let's keep this up, and I wish you, each and every one of you, to all the best in your finalized papers. And of course, what I like to do now is, I think I've got just maybe 3 minutes left. Yeah. So to actually say it's been great to listen to all the 3 of you, and also to have the benefit and the insights from the 2 commentators, Wei Huan and Heng Weng, and to listen to the 3 of you. And again, for example, Salvatore, I'm just picking you because you said it, it's still fresh in my mind. And the fact that you brought up this main problem about, you know, China being a central government, whereas EU is, you know, there are multiple governments and the clear focus of different foreign policies. And again, you brought in the BRI. So, you know, you can see how one topic leads to the other. And I think that's the beauty of it. You know, everything is entangled, or it's not in a mess, but it's there. And what we need to do is to dovetail and flesh out. And, you know, we can see the linkages. That's what I really am interested in, the linkages. The topics are all there, but they have specific strands, specific threads, but they will be interweaving of thoughts, and that's to be admired and to be actually promoted. So I want to thank all of the 3 speakers, Hui Chin, Lu Yao, Salvatore, and to the 2 commentators, Heng Weng, Wei Huan, and of course to the 2 backup support, very important, Jane and Fionn. So on that note, I think we will be going video link later on. But in the meantime, I wish to say that this is very kind, and I wish to thank the attendees for attending this, and those who look at the post video link. I wish each and every one of you all the best. Stay safe. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been a long day today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.